Sometimes the most broken hearts are the ones capable of the deepest compassion. Everyone deserves a second chance at finding family, even when the world has turned its back on them. In a war-torn medieval kingdom, ancient vampire Lord Cassian wanders alone, seeking forgiveness for his dark past. One snowy evening, he finds young Seraphina shivering beside a destroyed wagon, the only survivor of her village. She cannot speak, and her eyes show the pain of someone who has lost everything. But when Cassian approaches, she shows no fear of this mysterious figure in his dark cloak. He kneels down in the snow, and his voice is gentle when he says, "Come with me." In a world where monsters rule and kindness is rare, can two lost souls heal each other? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The kingdom of Vilethorn had not known peace for 3 generations. What had once been fertile valleys dotted with prosperous villages now lay scarred by endless conflict, the earth itself seeming to reject the blood that had soaked into its depths. Stone walls that had stood for centuries bore the black marks of siege fires, and the roads between settlements had become treacherous paths where only the desperate or the foolish dared to travel after dark. In this broken landscape, Cassian Montclair moved like a shadow-given substance, his crimson velvet cloak trailing behind him as he walked the abandoned roads. The fabric, once a symbol of his noble station, now served as both protection from the elements and a reminder of everything he had lost. The cloak had been a gift from his sister Elena on his 28th birthday, the last birthday he would ever celebrate as a mortal man. That had been 437 years ago, though the memory remained as sharp as if it had happened yesterday. The snow crunched beneath his boots as he approached what remained of the village of Millbrook. Like so many others, it had fallen victim to the raiders who swept through the countryside like locusts, taking what they pleased and leaving only ash and sorrow in their wake. The wooden houses had been reduced to charred skeletons, their blackened beams reaching toward the grey sky like the ribs of some great beast. The smell of smoke still lingered in the air, though the fires had been extinguished by winter's relentless grip days ago. Cassian had not come here seeking blood. Those days were long behind him, buried beneath centuries of regret and the slow, painful process of reclaiming whatever remained of his humanity. He had fed 3 nights ago from a willing donor in the city of Thorngate, a tavern keeper who traded his blood for the gold that would keep his establishment running through another harsh winter. It was an arrangement that suited them both. The man received payment for his service, and Cassian avoided the guilt that had once threatened to consume him entirely. No, he had come to Millbrook because he had heard the stories whispered in the taverns and market squares. Stories of survivors left behind, of people who needed help that would never come from the king's soldiers or the church's missionaries. In his endless wandering, Cassian had made it his purpose to find these forgotten souls and offer them what aid he could. It was a small penance for the centuries of darkness that lay behind him, but it was all he had to give. The wagon sat overturned at the village's edge, its contents scattered across the frozen ground. Bolts of cloth that would never become dresses, tools that would never build homes, dreams that would never be fulfilled. But it was not the wagon that stopped Cassian in his tracks. It was the figure huddled beside it, small and still as a carved statue. She was young, perhaps 20 summers, with dark hair that hung in tangled waves around a face pale from cold and shock. Her clothes, once of good quality, were torn and stained with mud and worse things. But it was her eyes that held Cassian transfixed. They were the deep blue of a mountain lake, and they held within them a pain so profound that even his undead heart seemed to ache in response. She did not flee when she saw him approach. She did not scream or reach for a weapon. Instead, she simply watched him with those enormous eyes, as if she had passed beyond fear into a realm where nothing could hurt her anymore because everything already had. Cassian stopped several paces away, careful not to loom over her or make any movement that might be interpreted as threatening. In his long coat and dark clothing, he knew he cut an intimidating figure. The years had not been kind to his appearance. His face bore the marble pallor of the undead, and his eyes held depths that spoke of centuries rather than decades. But he had learned to gentle his voice and soften his manner when dealing with those who had suffered trauma. "You need not fear me," he said quietly, his words creating small puffs of vapor in the cold air. "My name is Cassian. Are you hurt?" She opened her mouth as if to speak, but no sound emerged. Her lips moved soundlessly, and frustration flickered across her features before being replaced once again by that terrible, empty acceptance. Understanding dawned slowly. The trauma had stolen her voice, leaving her trapped within her own silence. Cassian had seen it before, in soldiers who had witnessed too much death, and in children who had lost their families to violence. The mind's way of protecting itself from unbearable pain sometimes came at the cost of one's ability to communicate with the world. "You cannot speak," he observed gently. "It was not a question. That matters not. There are many ways to communicate beyond words." He knelt in the snow, bringing himself down to her level. Even kneeling, he was tall, but the gesture served its purpose. She studied his face with those haunting blue eyes, searching for something, perhaps honesty, perhaps threat, perhaps simply another human connection in a world that had become devoid of warmth. "I know you have no reason to trust a stranger," Cassian continued, his voice barely above a whisper, "but I cannot leave you here to freeze. The night brings worse things than cold to these empty places." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I have a home not far from here. It is warm and safe, and there are kind people there who would welcome you. If you will allow it, I would like to take you there." For a long moment, they remained frozen in that tableau, the ancient vampire lord kneeling in the snow, and the traumatized young woman who had lost everything. The wind whistled through the ruins of Millbrook, carrying with it the scent of ash and approaching storm. Then, slowly, she nodded. The journey to Thornwick Castle took the better part of 2 hours, following paths that wound through dense forest and across streams that had begun to freeze at their edges. Cassian walked slowly, accommodating the young woman's exhausted pace and stopping frequently to ensure she was managing the difficult terrain. She had given no indication of her name, and he had not pressed her for it. There would be time for such things once she was safe and warm. Thornwick Castle rose from a hill like something from a fever dream, its grey stone towers reaching toward the clouded sky. It had been Cassian's home since shortly after his transformation, purchased from a bankrupt lord who had been grateful to escape his debts and flee to warmer lands. The castle was not large, as such structures went, but it was defensible and, more importantly, isolated enough that Cassian could live without drawing unwanted attention. As they approached the main gate, 2 figures emerged from the porter's lodge. Willem Ashford had served as the castle's groundskeeper for nearly 60 years, having taken the position as a young man when his predecessor had died of old age. He was approaching 70 now, his hair white as new snow, and his back bent from decades of hard labor, but his mind remained sharp and his loyalty absolute. Beside him walked his wife Martha, a woman whose maternal instincts had found outlet in caring for the various lost souls that Cassian brought to the castle over the years. "My lord," Willem said, his weathered face creasing with concern as he took in the sight of the young woman. "Another lamb in need of shelter?" "Indeed," Cassian replied. "She has lost her voice, and I suspect much more besides. Will you prepare the blue chamber? And ask Martha to heat some broth." Martha stepped forward, her plump face radiating the kind of warmth that could melt the hardest heart. She was perhaps 55, with graying brown hair kept in a neat bun and hands that were always busy with some task or another. "Of course, my lord. Come, dear one, let's get you warm and fed." The young woman looked uncertainly between the three faces before her. Cassian could see the calculations running behind her eyes. Could these people be trusted? Was this sanctuary real, or simply another trap in a world that had shown her nothing but cruelty? But something in Martha's motherly demeanor seemed to tip the balance, and she allowed herself to be guided through the castle's main entrance. The great hall of Thornwick Castle bore testament to both its current inhabitants' noble heritage and the weight of centuries that lay upon his shoulders. A massive tapestry dominated one wall, depicting a family scene rendered in rich blues and golds. The central figures were a man and woman in their prime, surrounded by 3 children, 2 boys and a girl. The craftsmanship was exquisite, every thread carefully chosen to capture not just the physical appearance of the subjects, but something of their essential nature as well. The young woman stopped before the tapestry, her eyes drawn to the girl in the image. She was perhaps 14 in the portrait, with golden hair and laughing eyes that seemed to sparkle even in thread form. There was something about her expression, a joy so pure it seemed to radiate from the very fabric that made the tapestry both beautiful and heartbreaking to behold. "My family," Cassian said quietly, coming to stand beside her. "From my mortal life." The girl was Elena, my youngest sister. The tapestry was commissioned for her 15th birthday, though she died of fever before it could be completed. The young woman turned to look at him, and for the first time since he had found her, something other than pain flickered in her eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or sympathy. It was a small thing, but it was enough to kindle a tiny flame of hope in Cassian's chest. "Come," he said gently. "Let Martha show you to your room. Tomorrow, when you have rested, we can begin to sort out what comes next." As Martha led the stressed young woman up the castle's main staircase, Cassian remained in the great hall, staring at the tapestry that had brought him both comfort and torment for longer than most mortals lived. The castle had sheltered many lost souls over the years, runaway serfs, displaced craftsmen, women fleeing violent husbands, children orphaned by war or disease. Some stayed for days, others for months. A few had made Thornwick their permanent home, becoming part of the strange family that had formed around Cassian's need for redemption. But something about this young woman felt different. Perhaps it was the depth of her silence, or the way she had looked at him without fear. Perhaps it was simply that her tragedy echoed his own, the loss of voice mirroring his loss of humanity, the stolen words reflecting his stolen life. Willem approached, his footsteps echoing softly in the vast space. "She reminds you of someone," the old man observed. It was not a question. "Perhaps," Cassian replied. "Or perhaps I simply see in her what I have become, someone broken by circumstances beyond their control, struggling to find meaning in the aftermath." "You found your meaning long ago," Willem said firmly. "Every soul you have saved, every kindness you have shown, that is your meaning, that is your redemption." Cassian turned from the tapestry, his pale features thoughtful. "Is it enough, Willem? Can a monster truly be redeemed, or does it simply become a better class of monster?" "I have served you for 6 decades, Willem replied. "In all that time, I have seen you show nothing but compassion to those who needed it. If that is not redemption, then the word has no meaning." Outside, the wind howled around the castle's ancient stones, and snow began to fall once again. But inside Thornwick's walls, warmth prevailed, the warmth of a fire in the hearth, the warmth of a meal shared, the warmth of a sanctuary offered to those who had nowhere else to go. In the blue chamber, Martha helped the young woman out of her torn traveling clothes and into a warm nightgown that had belonged to another refugee, long since moved on to a new life. The room was modest but comfortable, with a window that looked out over the castle's gardens and a fireplace that cast dancing shadows on the walls. As the young woman settled beneath thick blankets, her hand moved unconsciously to her throat, where a thin silver chain held a small wooden pendant. It was roughly carved, clearly the work of someone with more love than skill, and it bore the image of a flower, a simple daisy, its petals worn smooth by years of handling. Martha noticed the gesture but said nothing. Everyone who came to Thornwick carried something with them, a memento of their former life, a talisman against the darkness, a reminder of what they had lost. In time, if the young woman chose to share her story, Martha would listen. But for now, it was enough that she was safe and warm, and no longer alone in the world. The last thing the young woman saw before sleep claimed her was the gentle flicker of firelight on the stone walls, and the last thing she heard was the distant sound of Martha humming a lullaby as she made her way through the castle's corridors, checking on the other souls who called Thornwick home. Below, in the great hall, Cassian remained before the family tapestry, lost in memories of a life that felt both impossibly distant and heartbreakingly close. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions about how best to help the traumatized young woman rebuild her shattered life. But tonight, it was enough that she was safe, that she had taken the first step on what might prove to be a long journey back to wholeness. In a world where kindness had become a rare commodity, Thornwick Castle stood as a beacon of hope, a place where the broken could heal, where the lost could find their way, and where even the damned might discover that redemption was possible after all. The first night brought terrors that no amount of warmth or safety could banish. Seraphina, for that was the name Martha had gently coaxed from her, through patient gestures and kind persistence, woke screaming silently into the darkness, her throat working frantically, but producing no sound beyond harsh, desperate gasps. The nightmare was always the same. She stood in the doorway of her family's cottage, watching her younger sister Liana hanging laundry in the morning sun. Liana was humming. She was always humming, a simple melody their mother had taught them both when they were small. In the dream, Seraphina tried to call out a warning, tried to tell Liana to run, but no words would come. Then the raiders appeared, mounted figures in black leather who moved like death itself, and everything dissolved into fire and blood and the terrible silence that followed. She jerked upright in the unfamiliar bed, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird. The room was dark except for the dying embers in the fireplace, and for a moment she could not remember where she was. Then the memories came flooding back: the snow, the stranger in the crimson cloak, the castle on the hill. Her hand moved instinctively to her throat, fingers closing around the small wooden pendant that hung there. It was all she had left of her former life, carved by her father's hands during one of the long winter evenings when the family would gather around their own hearth. The flower depicted was a daisy, Liana's favorite. She had pressed a real one between the pages of their mother's prayer book, and their father had used it as his model when he carved the pendant for Seraphina's 16th birthday. The wood was warm beneath her fingers, worn smooth by years of nervous handling. Sometimes, when she held it just right, she could almost smell the workshop where her father had crafted furniture for the village sawdust and beeswax, and the particular scent of oak that had been properly seasoned. But tonight, like every night since the attack, the pendant felt like a weight around her neck, a constant reminder of everything that had been taken from her. A soft knock at the door interrupted her spiral into grief. She pulled the blankets up to her chin, unsure how to respond. The knock came again, gentle and patient, followed by a familiar voice. "Seraphina, it is Cassian. I heard that is. I wondered if you might be in need of company." She stared at the door, torn between the desire for solitude and the fear of being alone with her nightmares. After a long moment, she climbed out of bed and padded to the door on bare feet. The stone floor was cold, but not unpleasantly so. She turned the handle slowly, opening the door just wide enough to peer out. Cassian stood in the corridor, still fully dressed, despite the late hour. His pale features were etched with concern, and she noticed that he held a small tray bearing a steaming cup and what appeared to be honey, cakes. "Martha thought you might appreciate some warm milk," he said quietly. "She has found it helps with troubled sleep." Seraphina opened the door wider, stepping aside to allow him entry. He moved with careful precision, setting the tray on the small table beside the window before turning to face her. In the dim light from the dying fire, his features seemed even more otherworldly than they had in the snow. His skin held a luminous quality that spoke of something beyond mortal ken, and his dark eyes seemed to hold depths that no living man should possess. Yet there was nothing threatening in his manner. If anything, he seemed almost fragile, as if he feared she might flee at any sudden movement. It occurred to her that perhaps he was as unused to company as she was, to accepting help from strangers. "You do not sleep," she whispered, the words emerging as barely audible sighs. It was the first sound she had made since arriving at the castle, and they both started in. Surprise. Cassian's eyes widened slightly. "Your voice, it returns?" She touched her throat experimentally, then tried again. "Sometimes, when I am very tired, or very—" The words faded away, lost in the damaged pathways between thought and speech. "Do not force it," Cassian said gently. "Healing takes time, and trauma affects each person differently. I have known soldiers who could not speak of their battles for years after the fighting ended." He moved to the fireplace, adding fresh logs to the dying embers. Soon, flames danced cheerfully in the grate, casting warm light throughout the chamber. Seraphina settled into the chair by the window, wrapping a thick shawl around her shoulders. "You said I do not sleep," Cassian observed, returning to stand near the fire. "You are quite perceptive. Sleep has become something of a stranger to me in recent years." "Why?" The word emerged more clearly this time, though still barely above a whisper. Cassian was quiet for so long that Seraphina began to think he would not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of centuries. "I have done things in my life, terrible things that haunt me when I close my eyes. Sleep brings dreams, and dreams bring memories that are better left buried." He looked at her directly, his gaze steady and honest. "I suspect you understand something of that burden." She nodded slowly, her fingers tightening around the pendant. The warm milk Martha had sent was sweet and comforting, and she found herself relaxing slightly as the warmth spread through her chest. "Tell me of your family," Cassian said, settling into the chair across from her. "If you feel able. Sometimes speaking of those we have lost helps to honor their memory." Seraphina stared into the fire, watching the flames dance and flicker. For a moment, she could almost see Liana there, her bright smile, the way her hair caught the light when she moved, the graceful gestures she made when she told stories. "Liana," she whispered, "my sister. She was everything bright and beautiful in the world. She could make anyone laugh, even when times were hard. She wanted to be a storyteller, like the ones who would come through the village in summer." The words came slowly, painfully, but once she began speaking, it seemed easier to continue. She told him of her parents, her father's skill as a carpenter, her mother's herb garden that could cure any ailment. She spoke of the quiet life they had lived in Millbrook, the way the seasons marked their days, the simple contentment of knowing exactly where she belonged in the world. "They came at dawn," she said finally, her voice growing fainter. "Black riders on horses that seemed to breathe smoke. They took everything, the grain stores, the livestock, anything of value, and when the people tried to resist, she could not finish the sentence. The images were too vivid, too immediate. The screaming, the flames, the terrible efficiency with which the raiders had destroyed lives that had taken generations to build." Cassian leaned forward in his chair, his expression filled with gentle understanding. "You survived because you were not there when they came?" "I had gone to the next village to trade for winter wool," she whispered. "When I returned, everything was—" She gestured helplessly, unable to find words for the devastation she had witnessed. "You carry no guilt for surviving," Cassian said firmly. "Fate is cruel and arbitrary, but it is not something we can control. You lived because you were meant to live, perhaps to honor the memory of those who did not." Seraphina looked at him through eyes bright with unshed tears. "How do you bear it, the weight of loss?" "Poorly, most days," Cassian admitted with a rueful smile. But I have found that helping others, offering shelter, protection, simple kindness helps to balance the scales somewhat. Purpose can be found even in grief, if we are brave enough to seek it. They sat in comfortable silence for a time, watching the fire burn down to glowing coals. Outside, the wind had calmed, and snow fell gently past the window. The castle felt solid and permanent around them, a bastion against the chaos of the outside world. "This place," Seraphina said eventually. "How many others have you sheltered here?" "Dozens, over the years," Cassian replied. "Some stay for days, others for seasons. A few have made Thornwick their permanent home. Willem and Martha came here as a young couple, fleeing a lord who would have forced Martha into marriage. They have been with me for 60 years now. And you? How long have you called this place home?" Again, that pause that suggested depths she could not fathom. "Longer than you might expect," he said finally. "I came here in my darkest hour, seeking isolation. I found something better. I found purpose." As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of footsteps echoed in the corridor. A moment later, Martha appeared in the doorway, her motherly face creased with concern. "Forgive the intrusion, my lord, but I heard voices and wanted to ensure all was well." Her eyes moved between them, taking in the tray and the dying fire. "Ah, good. The warm milk helps with the nightmares." "Mrs. Ashford," Seraphina said softly, and Martha's face lit up with joy at the sound of her voice. "Oh, my dear, your voice is returning. That is wonderful news indeed." She bustled into the room, gathering up the empty cup and straightening the blankets on the bed. "Now then, you should try to get some more rest. Tomorrow I will show you around the castle properly, and perhaps we can find some work to keep your hands busy. I find that useful activity helps the mind heal, as surely as rest heals the body." As Martha prepared to leave, she paused at the door. "There is one more thing, dear. I noticed the pendant you wear. It is quite beautiful. Handmade, is it not?" Seraphina's hand moved to her throat automatically. "My father carved it. It was meant to be my sister, to remind me of my sister." Martha's expression grew gentle. "Then it is precious indeed. Such tokens help us carry our loved ones with us always." She looked meaningfully at Cassian. "We all have our ways of remembering those who have gone before." After Martha left, Cassian rose to take his leave as well. At the door, he turned back to face Seraphina. "If the nightmares return, do not hesitate to call out. The castle may seem large, but sound travels well through these old stones. You are not alone here, Seraphina. You need never be alone again, if you do not wish it." She nodded, something warm and unfamiliar stirring in her chest. It had been so long since anyone had offered her such simple, uncomplicated kindness. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything. Think nothing of it. Rest well." When he was gone, Seraphina settled back into the bed, pulling the blankets up to her chin. The pendant felt lighter around her neck somehow, less like a burden and more like the blessing it was meant to be. For the first time since the attack, she found herself thinking not of what she had lost, but of what might yet be possible. Outside her window, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the castle grounds in pristine white. But somewhere in the distance, barely audible above the whisper of winter wind, came a sound that made her blood run cold, the thunder of approaching hoofbeats, growing closer with each passing moment. The hoofbeats proved to be nothing more than a merchant's late arrival at a nearby village, but the fear they had awakened in Seraphina lingered through the following days, like smoke from a dying fire. She found herself starting at sudden sounds, a door closing, Willem's boots on the stone stairs, even the harmless crackling of logs in the hearth. Martha noticed, of course, and made gentle adjustments to the castle's routine, ensuring that Seraphina was never left alone without warning. It was during one of these careful attempts at normalcy that Seraphina made her first real discovery about her mysterious host. She had been exploring the castle's library, a vast chamber lined floor to ceiling with volumes that spoke of centuries of careful collection. Martha had encouraged the exploration, saying that reading might help restore her voice more fully, and Seraphina had always found comfort in books during troubled times. The library smelled of aged leather and parchment, with undertones of the herbs Martha used to keep the moths away. Tall windows let in the pale winter light, and a fire burned steadily in the massive stone hearth. It was while reaching for a volume of poetry on a high shelf that Seraphina accidentally knocked a leather-bound journal to the floor. The book fell open, revealing page after page of elegant handwriting in dark ink. She bent to retrieve it, intending only to close it and return it to its proper place, but her eyes caught on the words written there, and she found herself unable to look away. "The weight of eternity presses upon my shoulders like a shroud." Read the entry she had opened to. "Today marks the 300th anniversary of Elena's death, and still I can recall every detail of her final moments, the fever that burned through her small body, the way her hand felt in mine as the life left her. Would she recognize me now, I wonder? Would she see in this pale creature any remnant of the brother who once taught her to climb trees and catch fireflies?" Seraphina's breath caught in her throat. 300 years? The implications of those words sent her mind reeling. She turned the page with trembling fingers, finding more entries that spoke of impossible spans of time, of watching civilizations rise and fall, of the terrible loneliness that came with outliving everyone you had ever loved. "I fed tonight from a dying soldier on the battlefield near Greystone," read another entry, this one dated nearly 50 years earlier. "He was beyond saving, his life flowing away into the mud, and in his final moments he begged me to end his suffering. I granted his wish and took what little blood remained, telling myself it was mercy. Perhaps it was, but I felt like a vulture nonetheless, feeding on the carrion of war." "Seraphina?" Cassian's voice came from the library's entrance, gentle but concerned. "Martha said you had come here to—" He stopped mid-sentence as he saw the journal in her hands, and she watched as his pale features went even whiter, if such a thing were possible. She looked up at him, the book still open in her lap, her mind struggling to process what she had read. "You are," she began, but the words stuck in her throat. Whether from shock or her continuing vocal difficulties she could not say. Cassian moved slowly into the room, his movements careful and deliberate. "You have read my private thoughts," he said quietly. "I should have hidden that. Journal better. I forget, sometimes, that others might find their way into spaces I consider my own." 300 years, she whispered, her voice barely audible but clear enough that he could make out the words. 437, to be precise, he corrected, settling into the chair across from her. "I was transformed in the year of our Lord 1587 on a night much like this one, cold and full of snow." Seraphina stared at him, searching his features for signs of the supernatural nature he had just confirmed. Now that she knew what to look for, the evidence was there, the otherworldly pallor of his skin, the way he moved with inhuman grace, the depths in his eyes that spoke of centuries rather than decades. "You are a vampire," she said, the words emerging more as statement than question. "I am," he confirmed. "Does that knowledge frighten you?" She considered the question carefully, examining her feelings with the same thoroughness she might use to sort through her father's woodworking tools. Fear was certainly present. She would have been foolish not to feel some measure of it. But it was tempered by other emotions, curiosity about this impossible creature who had shown her nothing but kindness, and a strange sort of recognition that came from understanding what it meant to be marked by tragedy. "Should it?" she asked finally. Cassian smiled then, an expression that transformed his features from marble pale to something almost human. "Most would say yes. Vampires are creatures of legend and nightmare, after all. We are supposed to be monsters who prey upon the innocent and revel in darkness." "But you do not," Seraphina observed. "Prey upon the innocent, I mean." The journal speaks of guilt, of seeking redemption. Those are not the thoughts of a monster. Perhaps I am simply a different kind of monster, Cassian said, though his tone suggested he did not entirely believe it himself. One who has learned to despise what he has become. Seraphina closed the journal carefully, running her fingers over the worn leather cover. May I ask what happened? How you became what you are? Cassian was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of old pain, carefully contained but never fully healed. I was betrayed by someone I trusted. A friend, or so I believed, who had discovered the secret of vampiric transformation and thought to make himself immortal. He needed a test subject first, someone to ensure the process would work as intended. He paused, his hands clenching unconsciously into fists. I was young and naive and believed that friendship meant something. I learned too late that some people see others only as tools to be used. What was his name? Seraphina asked softly. Marcus Blackwood. He was a scholar, fascinated by the occult and the promise of eternal life. When he finally underwent the transformation himself, he reveled in what we had both become. He spoke of building an empire of the night, of ruling over mortals as gods among insects. And you did not share his vision? Cassian shook his head, his expression growing distant. I wanted only to return to my family, to find some way to explain what had happened to me. But vampiric transformation changes more than just the body. It awakens hungers that are difficult to resist, especially in the early years. I became something that my family would have feared, something that posed a danger to everyone I loved. Seraphina leaned forward in her chair, drawn by the pain in his voice. What did you do? I fled. I told myself it was for their protection, but in truth I was a coward. I could not bear to see fear in Elena's eyes, where once there had been only love and trust. He looked up at Seraphina, his dark eyes holding centuries of regret. I never saw any of them again. They lived their lives and died their deaths, while I wandered in darkness, learning slowly and painfully how to be something other than the monster I had become. The tapestry in the great hall that is them, the last image I have of my mortal family. Yes, I commissioned it from memory, decades after their deaths. It hangs there as both comfort and penance, a reminder of what I lost through my own choices. Seraphina reached across the space between them and placed her hand gently over his. His skin was cold, as she had expected, but it was also surprisingly soft, and she could feel the weight of his surprise at her touch. You were not responsible for what was done to you, she said firmly. The betrayal, the transformation, those were not your choices. And the decision to leave your family, she paused, choosing her words carefully. Perhaps that was the first truly human thing you did after being changed, protecting those you loved from potential harm, even at great cost to yourself. Cassian stared down at their joined hands, and Seraphina could see something shifting in his expression, a crack in the wall of self-recrimination he had built around his heart. You are generous in your interpretation, he said quietly. I am honest in my interpretation, she corrected. I know something of guilt, Cassian. I know what it feels like to believe that you should have been able to prevent a tragedy. But blame and responsibility are not the same thing. They sat in comfortable silence for a time, her hand still resting over his, both of them staring into the dancing flames. Outside, the winter wind whispered through the castle's ancient stones, but the library felt warm and safe, a sanctuary within a sanctuary. Why do you help people? Seraphina asked eventually. The refugees, the lost souls that Willem mentioned, why make their welfare your purpose? Because I cannot undo the past, Cassian replied. I cannot bring back my family or reclaim my mortal life, but I can try to ensure that others do not suffer needlessly. Each person I help, each life I preserve or improve, it helps to balance the scales somewhat. And does it work, this quest for balance? Cassian was quiet for a moment, considering. Some days I believe it does. Others, I fear that no amount of good deeds can truly atone for what I have become. But the attempt itself has value, I think. It keeps me connected to my humanity, even if that humanity is more memory than reality." Seraphina squeezed his hand gently. "It is not memory," she said with quiet conviction. "What you have shown me these past days, the kindness, the care, the genuine concern for my welfare that comes from a place that is entirely human. Whatever else you may be, you are not lost to humanity, Cassian. Not as long as you continue to choose compassion over cruelty, protection over predation." He looked up at her then, and she saw something in his eyes that might have been hope, fragile and tentative, but undeniably present. It was the look of someone who had been lost in darkness for so long that they had forgotten what light looked like, only to have it suddenly illuminated before them once again. The days that followed Seraphina's discovery of Cassian's true nature brought an unexpected peace to Thornwick Castle. Rather than driving her away, the knowledge seemed to have freed something within her, as if the burden of uncertainty had been lifted and replaced with understanding. She began to speak more freely, her voice growing stronger with each conversation, though it still carried the hushed quality of someone who had learned to be careful with words. It was during one of these conversations that she made her second significant discovery, one that would prove far more mysterious than the first. She had been helping Martha with the weekly cleaning of the castle's upper chambers when she stumbled upon Cassian's private study, a room she had not yet explored. Unlike the library with its scholarly atmosphere, this space felt intensely personal. The walls were lined with shelves, holding curious objects, ancient coins, pressed flowers in glass frames, small portraits of people long dead. But it was a small silver music box sitting on the desk that drew her attention. The box was exquisitely crafted, its surface etched with delicate roses and vines. Without thinking, she lifted the lid, and immediately the room filled with a hauntingly beautiful melody, simple notes that seemed to speak directly to the heart. The tune was achingly familiar, though she could not place where she had heard it before. Almost without conscious thought, she began to hum along, her voice blending with the tinkling notes of the music box. The melody awakened something deep within her, a memory just beyond the reach of consciousness. And as the music played, she found herself remembering fragments of her childhood, her mother singing as she worked in the garden, her father humming the same tune while he carved intricate patterns into wood. "That melody," came a voice from the doorway, and Seraphina turned to find Cassian standing there, his face pale with something that might have been shock. "Where did you learn it?" She closed the music box, cutting off the melody mid-phrase. I do not know. It seemed familiar, as if I had heard it long ago." She gestured apologetically. "I am sorry. I did not mean to intrude upon your private space." "Think nothing of it," Cassian said, though his voice carried a strange quality she had not heard before. He moved into the room, approaching the desk where she stood. The melody, it was my sister Elena's favorite. She would hum it constantly, especially when she was working on her embroidery or helping our mother with household tasks. Seraphina felt something cold settle in her stomach. "Your sister? The one from the tapestry?" "The very same." Cassian picked up the music box, cradling it in his hands as if it were made of spun glass. This belonged to her. It was a gift for her 14th birthday, crafted by the finest artisan in our region. She treasured it above all her other possessions. "But how could I know the melody?" Seraphina asked, though even as she spoke the words, a terrible suspicion was beginning to form in her mind. Cassian was staring at her with an intensity that made her feel exposed, as if he were looking not just at her face, but into the very depths of her soul. "Tell me," he said quietly, "what was your mother's name?" "Elena," Seraphina whispered, the word emerging before she had consciously decided to speak. "Elena of Millbrook. But she was born in Dutch." She stopped, her hand flying to her throat, as understanding began to dawn. "Ravenshallow," Cassian finished, his voice barely audible. She was born in Raven's Hollow, the daughter of a blacksmith named Thomas. Seraphina nodded slowly, her world tilting on its axis. How could you possibly know that? Instead of answering directly, Cassian moved to one of the bookshelves and withdrew a leather portfolio. He opened it carefully, revealing a collection of documents, letters, records, family trees drawn in careful script. He selected one particular paper and held it out to her. "I have spent centuries trying to trace what became of my family's bloodline," he said. "Not from any desire to interfere, but simply from a need to know that something of them survived. This is the genealogical record I have compiled over the years." Seraphina took the paper with trembling hands. The family tree was meticulously detailed, showing the descendants of Cassian's siblings through the generations. Her eyes followed the lines of connection downward through the centuries until they reached a name that made her heart skip a beat. Elena Montclair, born in Ravenshollow, married to Thomas Miller of Millbrook. Below that, in the same careful script, were listed Elena's children, Lyanna Miller and Seraphina Miller. "You are my great-great-great-niece," Cassian said softly. "The last of my family line, as far as I have been able to determine." Seraphina sank into the chair beside the desk, her legs suddenly unwilling to support her weight. "This cannot be," she whispered. "It is too much of a coincidence you're finding me, bringing me here." "Is it coincidence?" Cassian asked. "Or is it something else? I have walked these roads for decades, Seraphina, but I have never before felt compelled to investigate a ransacked village personally. Something drew me to Millbrook that night, something I could not name or understand." She looked up at him, seeing her own confusion reflected in his dark eyes. "The music box, the melody. Perhaps some memories run deeper than individual experience," he suggested. "Perhaps what we call instinct is simply the echo of inherited knowledge, passed down through generations in ways we do not fully comprehend." Seraphina thought of the wooden pendant around her neck, carved by hands that had learned their skill from a grandfather, who had learned from his father before him. How many generations of her family had worked with wood and stone, creating beautiful things with their hands? How many had hummed Elena's melody while they worked? "Does this change things between us?" she asked quietly. Cassian considered the question carefully. "It explains much," he said finally. "The sense of recognition I felt when I first saw you, the way your presence seems to ease the loneliness I have carried for so long. You are family, Seraphina, the only family I have left in this world. And you are mine," she realized, the words emerging with sudden clarity. "My parents and sister are gone, but I am not truly alone. I have." She paused, struggling to find the right term for what he was to her. "An uncle," Cassian supplied with a gentle smile. "A very old and somewhat unconventional uncle, but family nonetheless." Martha's voice interrupted their conversation, calling from somewhere in the castle's depths. "Lord, Cassian! Seraphina! Come quickly, Willem has news from the village!" They found Willem in the great hall, his weathered face grim with concern. He held a letter in his hands, the paper bearing the seal of the local magistrate. "What is it?" Cassian asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the news would not be welcome. "Reports of strange happenings in the neighboring villages," Willem replied. "Livestock found drained of blood, tracks in the snow that match no known animal. The magistrate is calling for a gathering of local lords to discuss the formation of hunting parties." Cassian's expression darkened. "Vampire hunters." "Aye, my lord. And there is more." Willem's eyes flicked to Seraphina, then back to Cassian. "There are reports of men asking questions about survivors from Millbrook. Apparently, word has spread that someone escaped the massacre." Seraphina felt the color drain from her face. "They are looking for me." "It would seem so," Willem confirmed, grimly, "though why, I cannot say." Cassian moved to stand protectively near Seraphina, his earlier gentleness replaced by something harder and more dangerous. "What else does the letter say?" "The magistrate requests your attendance at the gathering, my lord. As the Lord of Thornwick, Your participation would be expected. And if I refuse? Willem's expression grew even more troubled. Refusal might draw unwanted attention to the castle. Questions about why you would not wish to help hunt creatures that threaten the local population. Seraphina watched the interplay between the two men, understanding the unspoken communication that passed between them. Cassian's supernatural nature made him vulnerable to exposure, but his noble position also carried certain obligations that could not be easily ignored. "When is this gathering to take place?" she asked. 3 days hence," Willem replied. "In the town of Greybrook, at the magistrate's hall." Cassian turned to look at her, and she could see the conflict in his eyes, the desire to protect her warring with the need to maintain his carefully constructed human facade. "You will go," she said firmly. "You must. To do otherwise would invite suspicion." "I will not leave you here unprotected," he replied. "Not when there are men actively seeking you." "Then we will ensure I am well protected," Martha interjected, having appeared silently in the doorway, as she often did. "The castle has hidden places, rooms that have sheltered others in times of need, and Willem and I are not entirely helpless, despite our years." Seraphina nodded, feeling a strange sense of calm settle over her. The revelation of her family connection to Cassian had given her something she had not realized. She needed a sense of belonging, of being part of something larger than her own tragedy. She would not let fear drive her into making poor choices. "We will face this together," she said, looking between the 3 people who had become her family. "Whatever comes, we will face it together." Outside, the winter wind howled around the castle's ancient stones, and somewhere in the distance, the sound of hoofbeats echoed through the night. But inside Thornwick's walls, 4 people stood united by bonds, stronger than blood, the bonds of choice, of loyalty, and of love that transcends the boundaries between mortal and immortal, human and supernatural. The music box sat silent on Cassian's desk, but Elena's melody seemed to hang in the air around them, a reminder that some things endure beyond death, beyond time, beyond the reach of those who would do harm to the innocent. The discovery of their family connection had shifted something fundamental between Cassian and Seraphina, but it had also awakened new fears. If unknown forces were seeking her specifically, then her presence at Thornwick might endanger everyone she had come to care about. These thoughts weighed heavily on her mind as she explored the castle's chapel, the morning after Willem's disturbing news. The chapel was small and intimate, clearly designed for private worship rather than grand ceremonies. Stained glass windows cast jeweled light across stone floors, worn smooth by centuries of faithful feet. The altar was simple but beautiful, adorned with fresh flowers that Martha must have arranged despite the winter season. It was while cleaning the brass candlesticks that Seraphina's cloth caught on something hidden beneath the altar's edge. Her fingers explored the space until they found what felt like a small lever. When she pressed it, a section of the stone floor shifted with a grinding sound, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside lay several objects wrapped in oiled cloth, and among them a consecrated silver dagger whose blade gleamed with an otherworldly light. "You should not have that." Seraphina spun around to find Cassian standing in the chapel's entrance, his face pale with something approaching terror. She looked down at Plaise, the dagger in her hands, suddenly understanding the weapon's true purpose. "This is for you," she said quietly. It was not a question. Cassian moved slowly into the chapel, as if approaching a wild animal that might bolt at any sudden movement. "It is a precaution," he said carefully. "Something I hope will never be necessary. But you keep it close," Seraphina observed, noting the careful way he avoided looking directly at the blade. "Why?" He was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the stained glass windows rather than meeting her gaze. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of centuries of self-doubt. "Because there are moments, usually in the deep hours before dawn, when the darkness within me feels stronger than the light I have tried to cultivate. When the hunger becomes more than physical need and transforms into something altogether more dangerous. Seraphina set the dagger carefully on the altar, then moved to stand before him. And in those moments, I consider whether the world might be better served by my absence, he finished. Whether the good I try to do is sufficient payment for the evil of my existence. The honesty of his words hit her like a physical blow. She had grown so accustomed to thinking of him as her protector, her anchor in a world gone mad, that she had forgotten he carried his own burdens, his own struggles with despair. "That is not your choice to make," she said firmly. "The decision of whether your existence has value that belongs to those whose lives you have touched, not to your own guilt-ridden conscience." "Does it?" Cassian asked, finally meeting her eyes. "I am a predator, Seraphina. No matter how I try to minimize the harm I cause, no matter how carefully I choose my feeding, I am still a creature that requires human blood to survive. How many lives is my continued existence worth? How many have you saved?" she countered. "How many lost souls have found shelter? Here because you chose compassion over isolation. You speak of the lives your nature has cost, but what of the lives your choices have preserved?" Cassian moved to one of the chapel's wooden pews, settling onto the hard surface with a weariness that seemed to encompass far more than physical fatigue. "You are generous with your forgiveness." "I am realistic about human nature," Seraphina corrected, taking a seat beside him. "We are all capable of great good and great harm. The measure of a person or a vampire lies in which impulses they choose to follow." They sat in comfortable silence for a time, sunlight streaming through the colored glass to paint patterns on the floor between them. The chapel felt peaceful, sacred in a way that had nothing to do with religious doctrine and everything to do with honest conversation between two souls seeking understanding. "Tell me about your feeding," Seraphina said eventually. "You mentioned willing donors. How does that arrangement work?" Cassian looked at her with surprise, clearly not having expected such a direct question. "You truly wish to know? I am trying to understand all aspects of what you are," she replied. "If we are to be family, if I am to make informed choices about my life here, then I need to understand the reality of your existence, not just the parts that are easy to accept." He nodded slowly, appreciating her straightforward approach. "Very well. I require blood, perhaps twice a month. Sometimes less if I am careful about conserving my energy. I have arrangements with several people in various towns, individuals who provide what I need in exchange for payment or services rendered." "What sort of services?" "Protection, usually. A tavern keeper whose establishment is safer because word has spread that it is under my patronage. A merchant whose goods travel unmolested because his wagons bear a certain mark. The blood they provide is freely given, taken in amounts that will not harm them, and our transactions are conducted with full knowledge on both sides." Seraphina considered this information carefully. "It sounds almost mundane, not at all like the tales of vampires draining helpless victims. Those tales exist because there are vampires who choose that path," Cassian said grimly. "Marcus Blackwood, the one who transformed me, reveled in the terror he could inspire. He saw mortals as cattle to be harvested rather than people deserving of respect. I have encountered others of his kind over the years, and I can tell you that the dark legends are not entirely without foundation. But you chose differently." "I chose to remain as human as possible," he corrected. "The vampire nature is always present, always pushing toward predation and dominance. The choice must be made again and again, sometimes moment by moment." Seraphina reached over to take his hand, noting how her warmth seemed to flow into his cold fingers. "And yet you continue to choose correctly." "Most days," he admitted, "though I confess your presence has made the choice easier than it has been in many years." "How so?" Cassian turned to look at her directly, his dark eyes holding depths of emotion she was only beginning to understand. "Because you give me something to protect, a reason to be better than my nature would suggest. When I look at you, I see not prey but family, someone whose welfare matters more to me than my own comfort or desires. The warmth that spread through Seraphina's chest at his words was unlike anything she had felt since her family's death. It was the warmth of belonging, of being valued not despite her brokenness, but because of her entire self-flaws, trauma, and all. "I feel the same," she said softly. "You have given me a reason to heal, to move beyond mere survival towards something approaching hope." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of horses approaching the castle at speed. Through the chapel windows, they could see a small party of riders emerging from the forest, their mounts lathered with sweat, as if they had been riding hard for many miles. Cassian was on his feet instantly, his entire demeanor shifting from contemplative to alert. "Stay here," he instructed, moving toward the chapel's entrance. But Seraphina was already rising, her hand instinctively moving to the wooden pendant at her throat. "No," she said firmly. "We face things together, remember. Whatever this is, we face it together." They emerged from the chapel to find Willem already greeting the riders in the castle's courtyard. The party consisted of 4 men in the livery of the king's messenger service, their faces grim with the weight of urgent news. "Lord Cassian," the lead rider called, dismounting with practiced efficiency. "I bear word from His Majesty's court. There have been attacks in villages to the south. The king has issued a general call to arms for all noble houses." Cassian accepted the telesage, official document the messenger offered, his face carefully neutral as he read its contents. Seraphina could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw tightened as he processed whatever information the letter contained. "What sort of attacks?" he asked evenly. "Vampire attacks, my lord," the messenger replied. "Entire families found dead, drained of blood. The perpetrator appears to be moving northward, and there are fears he may be gathering followers. The king wishes all regional lords to coordinate their efforts to track down and eliminate this threat." Seraphina felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. The timing was too convenient, the northward movement too directly aimed at their location. "When did these attacks begin?" Cassian asked. "A fortnight ago, my lord. The first was reported in the village of Ashford, then Millbrook, then Millbrook." Seraphina interrupted, her voice barely above a whisper. "The attacks began in Millbrook?" The messenger looked at her with mild surprise, clearly not having expected to be addressed by someone he assumed to be a servant. "Aye, miss. Terrible business, that. Though there was one survivor, from what I heard, a young woman who managed to escape the carnage." Cassian and Seraphina exchanged a look, pregnant with meaning. The pieces were falling into place with terrifying clarity. Someone or something was following a trail that led directly to Thornwick Castle, leaving death and destruction in its wake. "I will, of course, pledge my support to His Majesty's efforts," Cassian said formally. "When is the next coordination meeting?" "Tomorrow evening, my lord, in Greybrook. The magistrate expects all regional lords to attend." As the messengers departed to spread word to other noble houses, Cassian and Seraphina remained in the courtyard, both lost in thought. The silver dagger hidden in the chapel suddenly seemed less like paranoid preparation and more like grim necessity. "Someone is coming for me," Seraphina said quietly, "using me to draw you out. Or using both of us to serve some purpose we do not yet understand," Cassian replied grimly. "Either way, we must be prepared." But preparation seemed an inadequate response to a threat whose scope and motivation remained shrouded in mystery. As they walked back toward the castle's warmth, both of them were acutely aware that their peaceful interlude was drawing to a close, and that the darkness gathering around Thornwick would soon demand answers they were not certain they possessed. The decision to attend the coordination meeting in Greybrook was not made lightly. Cassian's absence would leave Thornwick vulnerable, but his failure to appear would raise questions that could prove even more dangerous. As dawn broke over the castle on the day of his departure, preparations were already well underway to ensure Seraphina's protection during the perilous hours ahead. It was while helping Martha gather herbs for the journey, healing plants that might prove necessary if the evening went badly, that Seraphina made another discovery that would change everything she thought she understood about herself. The castle's herb garden occupied a sheltered courtyard where the winter sun could provide what warmth it possessed. Despite the season, Martha had managed to keep several hardy plants alive in cold frames and against the south-facing wall. As Seraphina knelt to harvest the last of the winter sage, her hand brushed against a moonstone pendant that had somehow fallen from her clothing. The stone, which she had never seen before in her life, began to glow with a soft, ethereal light the moment her skin made contact with it. "Where did this come from?" she breathed, holding the pendant up to catch the morning light. The moonstone seemed to pulse within a fire, its surface rippling with colors that had no earthly equivalent. Martha looked up from her own gathering, her eyes widening, as she took in the sight of the glowing stone. "Blessed Virgin," she whispered. "Child, where did you find that?" "I do not know," Seraphina replied honestly. "It was simply here, as if it had always been here." She turned the pendant over in her hands, marveling at the way the light seemed to emanate from within the stone itself. "What does it mean?" Before Martha could answer, Willem's voice called urgently from the castle's entrance. "Martha, Seraphina, come quickly. There has been an accident." They rushed inside to find Willem kneeling beside Cassian, who lay unconscious at the foot of the main staircase. Blood seeped from a gash on his forehead, and his normally pale complexion had taken on an alarming grey pallor. "What happened?" Martha demanded, immediately moving to examine the wound. "He was descending the stairs when he suddenly collapsed," Willem explained. "I heard the fall from the next room. He has been like this for several minutes. I cannot wake him." Seraphina dropped to her knees beside Cassian's still form, the moonstone pendant still clutched in her hand. Without conscious thought, she reached out to touch his forehead, intending only to check for fever. The moment her skin made contact with his, the pendant blazed with brilliant light, and warmth flowed from her fingers into his cold flesh. Cassian's eyes snapped open, his dark gaze immediately finding hers. The wound on his forehead was closing, even as they watched, the torn skin knitting together with supernatural speed. "What?" he began, then stopped as he noticed the light emanating from the stone in her hands. "Seraphina, what is that?" "I wish I knew," she replied, helping him sit up. "It appeared from nowhere, and when I touch it," she demonstrated, allowing her fingers to brush the stone's surface. Immediately, the glow intensified, and she could feel something stirring within her, like water finding its natural course after a long drought. Willem's weathered face was grave as he examined the pendant. "I have seen such stones before," he said quietly. "Many years ago, when I was still a young man. There were stories in my village, tales of women who could heal with a touch, who carried moonstones that glowed with inner light." "What sort of women?" Cassian asked, though his tone suggested he suspected the answer. "Wise women," Willem replied. "Healers. Some called them witches, though they used their power only for good. The stones were said to be gifts from the old gods, passed down through bloodlines that stretched back to the time before the church came to these lands." Seraphina stared at the pendant, pieces of a puzzle she had not known existed, suddenly clicking into place. "My grandmother," she said slowly. "She was known in our village as a healer. People would come to her when the physician's treatments failed. She could cure fevers with a touch, mend broken bones faster than nature intended. And she passed her gift to your B. Mother?" Martha asked gently. "Perhaps. Mother always knew which herbs to use for any ailment, and she had a way with injured animals that bordered on miraculous. But she never spoke of magic or moonstones." Seraphina looked up at Cassian, who was watching her with an expression she could not quite read. "What does this mean for us?" "It means," Cassian said carefully, "that your value to certain parties may be even greater than we suspected. Healing magic is rare, and those who possess it are often targeted by people who would use such gifts for their own ends. As if summoned by their conversation about magical gifts, a commotion erupted in the castle's courtyard. Through the windows, they could see armed men surrounding the building, not the king's soldiers or local militia, but mercenaries in dark leather, whose very presence radiated menace. Willem was already moving toward the weapons cabinet, but Cassian held up a restraining hand. "Wait," he said quietly. "Let us see what they want before we commit to violence." The answer came soon enough, delivered by a voice that rang with authority and barely contained rage. "Lord Cassian Montclair, I know you are within. I am Captain Marcus Mordecai of the King's Special Investigators. I have questions regarding recent vampire attacks in this region, and I will have answers." Cassian's entire body went rigid at the name. "Mordecai," he breathed, and Seraphina could hear centuries of old pain in that single word. "You know him?" she whispered. "I know the name," Cassian replied grimly. "Mordecai was the family name of a man I killed during my early years as a vampire, a cruel lord who was torturing his serfs for sport. If this is his descendant, then we face more than mere investigation." The captain's voice rang out again, closer now, as if he had entered the castle's main hall. "I seek the young woman who survived the Millbrook massacre. Turn her over, and no harm will come to the rest of you." Seraphina felt the moonstone pendant pulse against her palm, its light intensifying as her fear and anger grew. Around her, the very air seemed to shimmer with potential energy, as if the castle itself were responding to her emotional state. "I will not hide while others face danger on my behalf," she said firmly, rising to her feet. "You will not face this alone," Cassian replied, also standing. There was something different about his bearing now, less the careful gentleman and more the predator he had been born to become. If Mordecai seeks vengeance for his ancestors' death, then this was always going to be a confrontation between him and me. "But why involve me?" Seraphina asked. "What could he possibly want with a village survivor?" Willem's expression was grim as he handed Cassian a sword from the weapons cabinet. "Perhaps he knows what you are," he suggested. "Healers have always been valuable to those who fight dangerous battles. A captive healer could tip the balance in any number of conflicts." The implications of Willem's words sent ice through Seraphina's veins. If her magical abilities made her a target, then everyone she cared about would be in danger, simply by association. The peaceful life she had begun to build at Thornwick would become impossible. "There is another possibility," Martha said quietly, her face pale but determined. "Perhaps Captain Mordecai is not working alone. Perhaps he serves someone or something with an interest in both vampires and healers." Before anyone could respond to this disturbing suggestion, the sound of splintering wood echoed through the castle as the main doors were forced open. Heavy footsteps rang against stone floors, accompanied by the metallic clink of weapons and armor. Cassian moved protectively in front of Seraphina, his hand resting on the sword's hilt. "Whatever happens," he said quietly, "stay close to Martha and Willem. The pendant, keep it hidden until we understand what we face." But even as not, Seraphina tucked the moonstone beneath her clothing. She could feel its warmth pulsing against her skin, and with it came a strange sense of confidence. Whatever power flowed through her bloodline, whatever gifts her grandmother's people had possessed, she was no longer helpless. She was no longer just a victim of circumstance. She was something else entirely, something that might just prove capable of defending those she loved. The footsteps were approaching the great hall now, accompanied by voices that spoke of professional competence and barely contained violence. Captain Mordecai was coming, and with him came answers to questions that Seraphina and Cassian had not known they needed to ask. But they also brought new dangers, new choices that would test the bonds they had forged and the strength they had found in each other. The moonstone's gentle glow seemed to pulse in rhythm with Seraphina's heartbeat, as if the ancient magic within it were awakening in response to the self. Threats that surrounded them. Outside, storm clouds gathered on the horizon, dark and pregnant with the promise of change. Inside Thornwick Castle, 4 people prepared to face whatever came next, united by love and loyalty and the desperate hope that sometimes, just sometimes, good could triumph over the forces that sought to tear it down. The pendant pulsed once more against Seraphina's chest, and she felt something deep within her stir to life power that had slept for generations, waiting for the moment when it would be needed most. Captain Marcus Mordecai entered the great hall like a force of nature contained in human form. He was a tall man in his middle years, with graying hair and eyes like chips of winter ice. His bearing spoke of military training and absolute confidence in his own authority. Behind him came 4 soldiers, their hands resting casually on sword hilts in a gesture that managed to be both respectful and threatening. But it was not the captain's imposing presence that made Seraphina's breath catch in her throat. It was the ring he wore on his right hand, a blood-red ruby set in an ornate gold band that bore a familiar crest. "Lord Montclair," Mordecai said, his voice carrying the crisp authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed, "I confess myself surprised to find you here. Most vampires would have fled at the first sign of organized opposition." Cassian's hand moved instinctively to his own fingers, where an identical ring caught the light from the hall's windows. "Captain Mordecai," he replied evenly, "your reputation precedes you. I understand you have questions about recent attacks in the region." "Questions, yes," Mordecai agreed, his gaze moving slowly around the hall before settling on Seraphina. "But first, I believe introductions are in order. Young woman, would you be so kind as to tell me your name?" Seraphina lifted her chin, drawing strength from the warm pulse of the moonstone against her chest. "I am Seraphina, Miller of Millbrook." Indeed, something that might have been satisfaction flickered across Mordecai's features. "The sole survivor of that unfortunate incident. Tell me, Miss Miller, do you recognize this ring?" He held up his hand, angling the ruby so that its faceted surface caught the light. Seraphina found herself staring at it, memory stirring in the depths of her mind like sediment disturbed by a careless hand. She began, then stopped as images began flooding back. Her grandmother's voice, telling stories by the fire on long winter evenings. Tales of the old lord who had protected their village generations ago, the noble family whose crest bore the ruby and gold that now gleamed before her. "Your grandmother knew the stories," Mordecai said, watching her face carefully. "Stories of Lord Cassian Montclair, who vanished mysteriously on the eve of his wedding, leaving behind only rumors and unanswered questions." Cassian stepped forward, his own ring visible as he moved into the light. "What is your point, Captain?" "My point," Mordecai replied with the satisfaction of a hunter closing in on his prey, "is that Miss Miller's family has been connected to yours for far longer than either of you realized. Her bloodline carries more than just healing magic. It carries the memory of an oath sworn centuries ago." Seraphina felt the world tilt around her as more memories surfaced. Stories she had half forgotten rising like ghosts from the depths of childhood. Her great-great-great-grandmother had been more than just a village healer. She had been the appointed guardian of an ancient compact, a mystical bond forged between the Montclair family and those who served them. "The guardianship," she whispered, the word emerging without conscious thought. "Precisely," Mordecai confirmed. "Your ancestors swore to protect the Montclair bloodline, to serve as anchors for their humanity should darkness ever threaten to consume them. In return, the Montclairs swore to protect your people, to ensure that the guardian line would never want for shelter or sustenance." Cassian's face had gone even paler than usual, if such a thing were possible. "That compact was dissolved when I left Ravenshallow," he said quietly. "I released all those bound to my family's service." "Did you?" Mordecai asked with raised eyebrows. "Or did you simply run away before fulfilling your responsibilities? Magic that old does not simply fade because one party chooses to ignore it. The bond endured, passed down through generations, waiting for the day when guardian and charge would be reunited. Seraphina looked between the two men, pieces of an impossible puzzle clicking into place. "This is why I felt no fear when I first saw you," she said to Cassian. "Why your presence seemed familiar rather than threatening. The bond, it recognized you. And this is why you were drawn to investigate the Millbrook attack personally," Mordecai added. "The magic was calling. But you home, Lord Montclair, calling you to fulfill an oath you thought you had escaped." Willem, who had been listening with growing alarm, stepped forward. "What does this mean for them?" he demanded. "What are you suggesting?" Mordecai's smile was sharp as a blade. "I am suggesting that Miss Miller is far more valuable than anyone imagined. A guardian healer whose bloodline is mystically bound to one of the most powerful vampires in the kingdom? There are forces that would pay handsomely for such a prize." "You mean to sell her?" Cassian said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "I mean to collect the bounty that has been placed on her head," Mordecai corrected. "Though I confess the buyer's identity might surprise you." Before anyone could ask what he meant by that cryptic statement, the temperature in the hall plummeted. Frost began forming on the windows, and the very air seemed to thicken with malevolent presence. The soldiers behind Mordecai stepped back nervously, their hands moving to their weapons as shadows deepened in corners where no shadows should exist. "Ah," Mordecai said with satisfaction. "Right on schedule." A figure materialized from the gathering darkness, tall, pale, and radiating an aura of ancient power that made even Cassian seem young by comparison. Marcus Blackwood stepped into the hall as if he owned it, his dark eyes immediately finding Cassian with predatory intensity. "My dear student," Blackwood purred, his voice carrying the honey-sweet tones of a master manipulator. "How wonderful to see you again after all these years. You look well, surprisingly well for someone who has been fighting his nature for so long." Cassian's entire body went rigid, his hand moving to his sword's hilt. "Marcus," he breathed. "I thought you were dead, merely dormant," Blackwood corrected with an elegant wave of his hand. "Building resources, gathering allies, waiting for the proper moment to reclaim what was stolen from me." "I stole nothing," Cassian replied through gritted teeth. "Did you not?" Blackwood's gaze shifted to Seraphina, and she felt the weight of his attention like ice water in her veins. "You disappeared with knowledge that belonged to me, the location of the guardian bloodlines, the secrets of their magic. Do you have any idea how long I have searched for a living heir to one of the old families?" Understanding dawned with horrible clarity. "You arranged the attack on Millbrook," Seraphina said, her voice steady, despite the fear coursing through her. "You killed my family to drive me into the open." "Regrettable but necessary," Blackwood acknowledged with a casual shrug. "Your people had hidden themselves too well over the centuries. It required rather dramatic measures to flush out the surviving line." Cassian moved protectively in front of Seraphina, his supernatural nature finally revealing itself fully as his eyes blazed with inhuman light. "If you harm her, I will destroy you. Will you?" Blackwood asked with amusement. "Even knowing what she truly represents? The guardian bond does not simply provide protection, my dear Cassian. It provides control. With the proper application of leverage, a guardian can compel their charge to any action, no matter how contrary to their nature." The moonstone pendant suddenly grew hot against Seraphina's chest, and she could feel power coursing through her bloodline like fire in her veins. Images flashed through her mind, memories that belonged to her ancestors, knowledge passed down through generations of guardians. "You are wrong," she said firmly, stepping out from behind Cassian's protective stance. "The bond does not create slaves, it creates balance. Guardian and charge protect each other, but neither controls the other." Blackwood's eyes narrowed. "Pretty words, child. But words will not save you from what is to come." He raised his hand, and dark energy began gathering around his fingers. But before he could strike, Seraphina acted on instinct, born of inherited knowledge. She pulled the moonstone pendant from beneath her clothing, and it blazed with light so brilliant that everyone in the hall was forced to shield their eyes. When the light faded, a barrier of pure energy surrounded Cassian and Seraphina, pulsing with protective magic that made the air itself sing. Blackwood's attack struck the barrier and dissipated harmlessly, leaving him staring at them with something approaching respect. "Impressive," he acknowledged. "Perhaps this will be more interesting than I anticipated." But Mordecai was already moving, his soldiers spreading out to surround the protected pair. "The barrier will not hold forever," he called out. "Surrender now, and I guarantee Miss Miller will be treated well during transport to our employer." "Never," Cassian snarled, his humanity slipping away as the vampire within him responded to the threat against his charge. "I failed to protect my family once. I will not make that mistake again." Seraphina felt the truth of their bond, settling into place around them like a perfectly fitted garment. She was his guardian, bound by magic older than kingdoms to anchor his humanity and amplify his strength. He was her protector, sworn by that same ancient compact to shield her from harm, even at the cost of his own existence. Together, they were something neither could be alone, a perfect synthesis of mortal magic and immortal power. "Then let us see," Blackwood said with cold anticipation, "whether an ancient bond can stand against modern ambition." The battle for Thornwick Castle was about to begin. The protective barrier that surrounded Cassian and Seraphina pulsed with ethereal light, but even as it held Blackwood's dark magic at bay, both of them could feel its power beginning to waver. Ancient magic was not meant to be sustained for long periods, and the effort was taking its toll on Seraphina's untrained abilities. "How long can you maintain this?" Cassian asked quietly, his eyes never leaving their enemies. "Not long enough," Seraphina admitted, sweat beading on her forehead despite the supernatural cold that Blackwood's presence had brought to the hall. "The magic, it wants to be used differently, not as a shield, but as something else." Around them, Mordecai's soldiers had taken up strategic positions, cutting off all routes of escape. Willem and Martha huddled near the great fireplace, the elderly couple's faces grim with the knowledge that they were witnessing something far beyond their ability to influence. But Willem's weathered hands were not idle. Seraphina noticed he was slowly, carefully, moving toward a section of the stone wall that looked identical to every other section, but somehow felt different to her newly awakened magical senses. "The ward stones," she breathed, understanding flooding through her as inherited knowledge surfaced. "Willem knows about the ward stones." Cassian followed her gaze and nodded almost imperceptibly. The protective barriers that had guarded Thornwick for centuries were still in place, but they had been dormant for so long that even he had forgotten their existence. If they could be reactivated, "Unfortunately for you both," Blackwood interrupted their silent communication, "I am not the only threat you face this evening." As if summoned by his words, more figures began materializing from the shadows around the hall's perimeter. These were not mercenaries or soldiers, but creatures of darkness, vampires, whose eyes held nothing of humanity, ghouls, whose very presence seemed to suck warmth from the air, and other things that defied easy classification but radiated malevolence like a fever. "You brought an army," Seraphina observed, her voice steady despite the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. "I brought tools," Blackwood corrected. "Creatures bound to my will through centuries of careful cultivation. They care nothing for your guardian bond or your noble intentions. They serve only hunger and the promise of violence." Captain Mordecai shifted uncomfortably as the supernatural entities took their positions. Clearly, whatever arrangement he had made with Blackwood had not included quite so many non-human participants. His soldiers, trained professionals though they were, began showing signs of nervousness as the temperature continued to drop and the very air seemed to thicken with malevolent intent. "This was not part of our agreement," Mordecai said carefully. "Agreements change," Blackwood replied without looking at him, "as do the methods required to achieve desired outcomes. You wanted the girl delivered alive. You said nothing about the condition of everyone else in this forsaken castle. Willem had reached the wall section he sought, and his fingers found hidden catches that had not been touched in living memory. Ancient mechanisms groaned to life, and suddenly lines of silver light began racing along the hall's floor, patterns that formed geometric designs of incredible complexity, all centering on the spot where Cassian and Seraphina stood. The castle's foundation stones, Martha said suddenly, her voice filled with wonder. They were carved by the same people who made your pendant, child? This entire structure was built as a focus for guardian magic. Seraphina felt the truth of Martha's words resonating through her bones. Thornwick Castle was not just Cassian's refuge. It was a stronghold designed by her ancestors, created specifically to amplify the power of the guardian bond. The moonstone pendant grew warm against her chest, responding to the awakening magic that surrounded them. Clever, Blackwood acknowledged, though his tone suggested more annoyance than concern. But ward stones require a living guardian to activate them fully, and you, child, barely understand the power you carry. At best, you might manage a few moments of enhanced protection before the effort burns you out entirely. Perhaps, Seraphina agreed, but a few moments might be enough. She reached out to take Cassian's hand, and the moment their skin made contact, power flowed between them, like lightning finding its preferred path. The barrier around them shifted and changed, becoming not just a shield, but a conduit for the forces that lay sleeping in Thornwick's ancient stones. Cassian gasped as strength flooded through him, not the dark power of vampiric nature, but something cleaner and more sustainable. His enhanced senses expanded beyond anything he had experienced in 4 centuries of undead existence, and he could suddenly perceive the castle as a living entity, responsive to his will and protective of those within its walls. "Now I understand," he said softly. "This is what the bond was truly meant to accomplish, not control, but synthesis. Guardian and charge becoming something greater than the sum of their parts." Blackwood's expression shifted from confidence to uncertainty as he watched the transformation taking place before him. The ward stones throughout the castle were awakening one by one, their silver light driving back the unnatural darkness he had brought with him. His bound creatures began to show signs of distress, several of them backing away from the expanding sphere of protective energy. "Impossible," he snarled. "No guardian has possessed that level of power for 3 centuries. The bloodlines have been too diluted, too scattered." "You forgot something important," Seraphina replied, her voice now carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate with the very stones of the castle. "My family were not just guardians, we were survivors. Every generation that endured persecution, every ancestor who hid their gifts to protect their children, every life lived in secret and silence, all of that accumulated power, waiting for the right moment to be unleashed. The magical feedback between guardian and charge was creating something unprecedented. Cassian's vampiric nature was not being suppressed or controlled, but rather refined and focused. The hunger that had driven him for centuries transformed into protective instinct, and the supernatural strength that had once served only his own survival now served something greater. But the effort was taking its toll. Seraphina could feel the magic burning through her mortal frame like fire through dry timber. Human bodies were not designed to channel power on this scale, and even with the castle's stones to help bear the load, she knew she could not sustain this level of output for much longer. Willem, perhaps sensing her distress, called out from his position by the ward controls. "The outer defenses are awakening, my lady. The castle's protective perimeter is re-establishing itself." Indeed, through the great windows, they could see lights beginning to flicker in the castle's courtyard and gardens' ancient stone markers that had stood dormant for centuries now blazing with renewed purpose. Any supernatural creatures attempting to approach Thornwick from outside would find themselves facing barriers that had been designed by some of the most powerful guardians in history. But Blackwood and his forces were already inside those defenses, and the ward stones, for all their power, were not weapons of attack. They could protect and strengthen, but they could not directly harm those who threatened the castle's inhabitants. A magnificent display, Blackwood admitted with grudging respect, but ultimately pointless. You have made yourselves stronger, yes, but you have also made yourselves more valuable. The power you are channeling will make the girl an even more prized possession, and vampire hunters will pay fortunes for the secret of controlling a being such as you have become. Cassian. Mordecai stepped forward, his military training reasserting itself now that he could see a clear objective. Lower your defenses and surrender, he commanded. This display has gone far enough. No one needs to die tonight. You are right, Seraphina said quietly. No one needs to die tonight. She looked at Cassian, and in his dark eyes she saw the same understanding that was growing within her. The guardian bond was not just about protection or enhancement, it was about choice. The choice to stand against darkness even when the odds seemed impossible. The choice to protect not just those you loved, but the principles that made life worth living. But some prices are too high to pay, Cassian added, his voice carrying the weight of centuries of hard-won wisdom. And some compromises leave you with nothing worth preserving. Martha and Willem exchanged a look across the great hall, and something passed between them, a communication born of 60 years of marriage and shared purpose. Willem nodded once, then began manipulating the ward controls with new purpose, while Martha moved toward a section of the wall that held items Seraphina had not noticed before. The castle has more defenses than just the ward stones, Martha said calmly, lifting what appeared to be an ancient horn carved from some massive creature's tusk. Thornwick was built to be the last refuge of the guardian families. If necessary, it can become something more than just a sanctuary. Blackwood's eyes narrowed as he recognized the artifact in Martha's hands. You would not dare. The cost would be acceptable, Martha finished firmly. Some things are worth any price. The horn, Seraphina realized through her connection to the castle's awakened magic, was designed to send a call across vast distances, a summons that would reach every descendant of the guardian bloodlines, no matter how scattered or hidden they might be. It would also alert the church authorities to the existence of supernatural forces in the region, bringing down investigation and potential persecution upon everyone in the vicinity. But it would also ensure that Blackwood could not simply disappear into the night with his prize, free to experiment upon a captive guardian at his leisure. Choose quickly, Blackwood said, his voice dropping to a silky whisper that somehow carried clearly throughout the hall. Surrender the girl willingly, and I will allow the rest of you to live. Refuse, and I will take her anyway, leaving nothing but corpses and ruins in my wake. Seraphina felt the ward stones pulsing around them, felt Cassian's strength flowing through their bond, felt the weight of centuries of guardian tradition and sacrifice pressing down upon her shoulders. The choice was hers to make, and whatever she decided would echo through the lives of everyone she had come to love. The moment of decision had arrived, and with it would come either salvation or catastrophe. The decision, when it came, surprised everyone in the hall, including Seraphina herself. I choose neither surrender nor flight, she announced, her voice carrying the authority of awakened power. I choose to fight. The moonstone pendant blazed with light so intense that even the vampires were forced to shield their eyes. But this was not the gentle, protective glow it had shown before. This was something altogether more primal, more dangerous. The ward stones throughout the castle responded to her declaration, their silver light shifting to deep gold as ancient defensive mechanisms prepared to become offensive weapons. Blackwood's confident expression faltered for the first time. You do not understand the forces you are attempting to control, child. Guardian magic was never meant for direct conflict. You are wrong, Seraphina interrupted, inherited knowledge flowing through her consciousness like a river finally finding its proper course. Guardian magic was meant for whatever purpose the Guardian deemed necessary. My ancestors were not simply healers and protectors, they were warriors when warfare was required. Cassian felt the change in her through their bond, felt the surge of power that transformed his beloved charge into something magnificent and terrible. The vampire within him, which had cowered for centuries beneath layers of guilt and self-recrimination, suddenly roared to full awareness, not with hunger or bloodlust, but with the fierce joy of a predator finally given worthy prey. "Together," he said simply, and Seraphina nodded. The first attack came from Blackwood's bound creatures, ghouls and lesser vampires, who rushed forward with inhuman speed, their claws and fangs gleaming in the golden light of the ward stones. But they had not anticipated facing a guardian and her charge working in perfect harmony. Seraphina's power flowed through Cassian like liquid lightning, enhancing his already supernatural abilities beyond anything he had ever imagined possible. He moved like a force of nature, striking with precision that turned defensive action into devastating counterattack. The first, a ghoul to reach him, was torn apart before it could land a single blow, its unholy essence scattered by the purifying energy that now surrounded Cassian like armor. But their victory came at a cost. In the chaos of battle, Willem stumbled while trying to maintain the ward controls, and Mordecai's soldiers saw their opportunity. One of them lunged forward with his sword drawn, aiming not for Cassian or Seraphina, but for the elderly groundskeeper whose knowledge of the castle's defenses made him a crucial target. "Willem!" Martha's cry echoed through the hall as she saw the blade descending toward her husband of 60 years. Time seemed to slow as Willem turned toward the approaching weapon, his weathered face calm with the acceptance of someone who had lived a full life in service to something greater than himself. The sword struck home with sickening finality, and Willem Ashford, faithful guardian of Thornwick Castle, crumpled to the stone floor. The effect of his death on the ward, the system was immediate and catastrophic. Without his skilled hands to guide them, the ancient mechanisms began fluctuating wildly, their golden light flickering and dimming as protective barriers wavered throughout the castle. Martha's scream of grief and rage filled the hall, but it was Cassian's reaction that truly changed the nature of the battle. The careful control he had maintained for centuries shattered like glass beneath the weight of witnessing an innocent man's murder. The vampire within him, enhanced and refined by Seraphina's power, but no longer restrained by guilt or self-doubt, erupted into full manifestation. His pale features shifted, revealing the predatory nature that lay beneath his gentlemanly facade. His eyes blazed with crimson light, and his movements became fluid and inhuman as he abandoned all pretense of mortality. But this was not the mindless rage of a monster. This was the calculated fury of a protector who had lost someone under his care. "You want a monster, Marcus?" he snarled, his voice carrying harmonics that made the very stones of the castle tremble. "Let me show you what 4 centuries of suppressed nature looks like when it is finally given purpose." The soldier who had killed Willem tried to retreat, but Cassian was already upon him. The man's scream was cut short with brutal efficiency, and when Cassian rose from the corpse, his lips were stained with blood, and his expression held no trace of the gentle lord who had offered shelter to the lost. Seraphina felt his transformation through their bond and made a choice that would have terrified her days before. Instead of trying to restrain or control the darkness that had awakened within him, she embraced it, not the evil it could become, but the protective force it chose to be. Her power flowed into him without reservation, amplifying his vampiric nature while keeping it anchored to purpose rather than bloodlust. The result was something unprecedented in the long history of guardians and vampires, a perfect fusion of mortal magic and immortal hunger, directed with surgical precision against those who threatened the innocent. Blackwood's remaining creatures began to show signs of genuine fear as they realized what they were facing. This was not the conflicted, guilt-ridden vampire they had expected to overwhelm with numbers. This was apex predator, enhanced by ancient magic, fighting not for survival, but for vengeance. But Blackwood himself was far from defeated. As his minions fell around him, he began channeling dark power on a scale that made his earlier displays seem trivial. The temperature in the hall plummeted until frost formed on every surface, and shadows deepened into pools of liquid darkness that seemed to move with malevolent intent. "If I cannot have the girl alive," he declared, his voice carrying the chill of the grave, "then I will ensure that no one else can claim her either." Mordecai, seeing the battle turning against his supernatural ally, made a choice that proved he was more pragmatist than zealot. "Retreat!" he called to his remaining soldiers. "This was never our fight to finish." But it was too late for clean withdrawals. The hall had become a battlefield where mortal concerns held little relevance, and escape would require surviving forces that cared nothing for human limitations or military protocols. Seraphina felt the crushing weight of Blackwood's power pressing down upon them like a physical force, threatening to overwhelm even their enhanced abilities. The ancient vampire's dark magic sought to drain the life from everything it touched, turning the very air toxic with malevolent energy. But as she struggled against the assault, her fingers found the one artifact in the hall that might turn the tide. Willem's fallen form still clutched something in his weathered hands. It was Cassian's original crown from his mortal lordship, the circlet of gold and silver that had been lost during his transformation centuries ago. Willem must have retrieved it from some hidden vault, recognizing its significance in a way that even Cassian had not fully understood. "The crown," she gasped, reaching for the artifact. "Cassian, your crown." The moment her fingers made contact with the ancient metal, power flowed through the guardian bond with renewed intensity. But this was different from the raw magical energy they had been channeling. This was refined, focused, carrying within it the accumulated authority of generations of noble rule and protective leadership. Cassian's eyes widened as he understood what she was offering him. "Seraphina, no. The cost. The cost is mine to pay," she said firmly, lifting the crown toward him. "This is what the bond was always meant to create, not a monster controlled by a guardian, but a king protected by one." As she placed the crown upon his head, transformation swept through both of them. The metal, touched by her guardian magic and steeped in centuries of noble purpose, began to change. Thorns of silver grew from its surface, not the thorns of pain or punishment, but the thorns of protection, of boundaries that would not be crossed. Cassian felt his vampiric nature shift and crystallize into something entirely new. The hunger remained, but it was transmuted into purpose. The predatory instincts endured, but they were refined into protective vigilance. He was still a vampire, but he was also something more, a guardian king, bound by magic and choice to defend those who could not defend themselves. The crown's transformation sent waves of power throughout Thornwick Castle, and the ancient wardstones responded with blazing light that drove back Blackwood's darkness. The shadows that had pooled in the corners of the hall fled like living things, and the supernatural cold began to give way to natural warmth. But Seraphina paid the price for channeling such transformation. Blood ran from her nose, and her hands shook with the effort of maintaining the magical bridge between mortal and immortal natures. The pendant at her throat was blazing so brightly that it seemed ready to burn through her very flesh. Martha, still grieving over Willem's body, saw Seraphina's distress and made a choice that reflected 60 years of caring for others. She struggled to her feet and placed her hands on the young woman's shoulders, lending what strength she possessed to the effort. "We are all guardians here," Martha said firmly, "all protectors of what matters." The support, small though it was, proved crucial. With Martha's help, Seraphina was able to stabilize the transformation and direct its full force against their enemies. Blackwood staggered beneath the assault of purified power, his dark magic crumbling before the combined might of guardian, protector king, and loyal retainer. His bound creatures began dissolving entirely, their unnatural existence unable to maintain cohesion in the face of such sanctified opposition. "Impossible," he snarled, his ancient features twisting with rage and disbelief. "No guardian has possessed this level of power since the first age of magic." "Perhaps," Cassian agreed, rising to his full height as the crown settled into place with a sound like distant thunder. "But you made a crucial error in your calculations, Marcus. You assumed I was still the same frightened young man you transformed centuries ago." The Vampire King moved with fluid grace, his enhanced nature now perfectly balanced between darkness and light. When he struck, it was with the force of centuries of accumulated guilt transformed into righteous purpose. Blackwood tried to defend himself, but his dark magic could find no purchase against power that had been purified by sacrifice and tempered by love. Captain Mordecai, seeing his supernatural ally defeated, attempted one final gambit. He lunged toward Seraphina with his sword drawn, calculating that her death would disrupt the guardian bond and leave Cassian vulnerable. But he had forgotten about Martha, who still stood protectively beside the young woman. The elderly woman stepped into the sword's path without hesitation, taking the blade meant for Seraphina and collapsing with a soft sigh. "No!" Seraphina's cry echoed through the hall as she caught Martha's failing form. The older woman's eyes were already glazing, but she managed a gentle smile. "Protect them all, child," Martha whispered. "Protect them all." Her death sent shockwaves through the guardian magic, but instead of weakening it, the sacrifice seemed to strengthen and purify it further. The love and loyalty that Martha had embodied became part of the magical structure that bound the castle's defenders together. Cassian's response to Martha's murder was swift and final. Mordecai's scream was cut short as vampiric justice found him, and the captain who had orchestrated so much suffering learned too late that some prices could only be paid in blood. The hall fell silent, except for the gentle hum of ward stones and the distant sound of Blackwood's remaining soldiers fleeing into the night. The immediate battle was won, but at a cost that would forever change those who survived it. Seraphina knelt beside Martha's still form, tears streaming down her face as she mourned the loss of another mother figure. But through the grief, she could feel something new settling into place around her, a sense of completeness, of purpose finally understood and accepted. She was no longer just a survivor seeking shelter. She had become what her bloodline had always been meant to produce, a guardian in the truest sense of the word. 3 months had passed since the battle that transformed Thornwick Castle from a simple refuge into something far more significant. Spring had returned to the kingdom of Vilethorn, bringing with it new life and the promise of renewal. In the castle's great hall, where violence had once threatened to tear apart everything precious, a very different scene now unfolded. Seraphina stood before a large canvas, her brush moving with confident strokes as she captured the essence of the family that had grown around her. The portrait showed not the noble bloodlines of centuries past, but the chosen bonds that had proven stronger than death itself. In the center stood Cassian, still pale and otherworldly, but wearing his reforged crown with quiet dignity. Beside him, Seraphina had painted herself, the moonstone pendant visible at her throat, her eyes bright with the wisdom that came from surviving transformation. But it was the other figures in the painting that truly captured the essence of what Thornwick had become. Willem and Martha were there, painted not as they had been in their final moments, but as they lived on in memory. The groundskeeper, with his weathered hands and gentle smile, the motherly woman, whose love had encompassed everyone who sought shelter beneath their roof. Around them were the faces of others who had found their way to the castle in the weeks following the battle, refugees and outcasts, damaged souls seeking healing, individuals who had nowhere else to turn. "You have captured them perfectly," came a familiar voice from the hall's entrance. Cassian approached the easel, his movements carrying the fluid grace that marked his supernatural nature, but tempered now by the authority of genuine leadership rather than predatory power. "I wanted to show how love creates family," Seraphina replied, setting down her brush and turning to face him. "How choice can be stronger than blood, and how sanctuary becomes home when it is built on the right foundations." The crown of thorns that rested upon Cassian's brow had changed in the month since the battle. What had begun as a symbol of sacrifice had evolved into something more complex, a reminder that true protection often required difficult choices, but that those choices could be made with love rather than violence as the driving force. "The children from Millbrook have adapted well," Cassian observed, noting the small faces scattered throughout the painting. Word had spread through the refugee networks that Thornwick offered more than temporary shelter, and families who had lost their homes to various tragedies had begun making their way to the castle. Not all stayed permanently, but all left changed by the experience of true sanctuary. "Young Thomas is showing remarkable aptitude for Willem's old duties," Seraphina agreed, referring to a boy whose parents had died in the same raid that destroyed her village. "And little Elena." She paused, emotion catching in her throat as she spoke the name that connected past and present. "She reminds me so much of my sister. The way she laughs, the songs she hums while working." Cassian moved to stand beside her, his cold hand finding hers in a gesture that had become natural over the months of their partnership. "Willem and Martha would be proud of what this place has become." They had buried the faithful couple in the castle's garden, beneath stones carved with protective symbols that would guard their rest through all the ages to come. But their influence lived on in every decision made about the castle's future, in every lost soul offered shelter, in every act of kindness that rippled outward from Thornwick's walls. "The reports from the king's investigators have been favorable," Cassian continued, his tone growing more formal as he addressed practical matters. "Captain Mordecai's disappearance has been attributed to vampire attack, and our role in defending the region against supernatural threats has earned official recognition. We will not be troubled by questions about the true nature of what occurred here." Seraphina nodded, understanding the delicate balance they maintained between their supernatural reality and the mortal world's expectations. The guardian bond allowed her to help Cassian appear, convincingly human when necessary, while his vampiric abilities ensured that threats to their charges could be dealt with swiftly and efficiently. "Any word from the other guardian bloodlines?" she asked. "Two families have made contact through the old networks," Cassian replied. "The Silverbrook line from the eastern provinces and a group calling themselves the Dawn Keepers from across the southern border. It seems our battle with Blackwood sent ripples through the magical community. Other guardians are emerging from hiding, seeking to restore the old alliances." This was perhaps the most significant long-term consequence of their victory. For centuries, the Guardian families had lived in isolation, their bloodlines scattered and their knowledge fragmentary. But the successful defense of Thornwick had proven that the old magic still held power and that Guardian and Charge could work together as partners rather than master and servant. "Will you accept their offers of alliance?" Seraphina asked. "We will consider them carefully," Cassian said diplomatically. "But any partnership must respect what we have learned about the true nature of the Guardian bond. Equality, not subservience. Cooperation, not control." Through the great windows, they could see the castle's gardens flourishing in the spring sunshine. Children's laughter echoed from the courtyard, where a group of young refugees played under the watchful eyes of their caretakers. Smoke rose from the kitchen chimneys, carrying the scent of fresh bread and the promise of shared meals around long tables. This was what victory looked like, not the dramatic triumph of good over evil, but the quiet persistence of love over despair, of hope over resignation. Seraphina's journal lay open on a nearby table, its pages filled with entries that documented the gradual healing of trauma and the slow building of trust. Her voice had grown stronger with each passing day, until now she could speak with the authority. that came from understanding her true purpose. "I think," she said thoughtfully, "Willem and Martha knew this would happen. All of it, the attack, the battle, even our transformation. I think they understood that sometimes places must be tested by fire before they can become what they were meant to be." Cassian considered her words, his ancient wisdom merging with the perspective she brought to their shared existence. Perhaps they did. Perhaps that is the true nature of faith, not the certainty that things will work out as we hope, but the commitment to do what is right regardless of the outcome. As evening approached, the inhabitants of Thornwick Castle began gathering in the great hall for their communal meal. The long table that had once served only Cassian's solitary existence now accommodated dozens of people, their conversations filling the space with warmth and life. Seraphina took her place beside Cassian, the moonstone pendant glowing softly against her throat as she looked out over their unusual family. They were not united by blood or tradition, but by choice and circumstance, and the simple recognition that everyone deserved a place to belong. The portrait she had painted captured this truth, that love could create bonds stronger than magic, that healing was possible even after the deepest wounds, and that sometimes the most profound victories were measured not in enemies defeated, but in souls saved. In a world where darkness still prowled the edges of civilization, Thornwick Castle stood as proof that light could endure, that hope could flourish, and that redemption was always possible for those brave enough to choose love over fear.